Whoa, RTX with like a weird like ghosty thing. Here's a 6600. Its MSRP is $329.99. Here is a RTX 3060. Its MSRP is $329.99. And nobody has ever bought either of these cards for those prices. Maybe the 6600 on launch day. This Strix version I don't think has ever sold for $329.99. And I don't know if it ever will. I wouldn't expect it to. So yeah, in reality, here's the thing. That Speedster Swift 210 right here, that's the 6600 model that I'm actually benchmarking in this video. And notice, that's actually the cheapest one available right now. So that's interesting. Now, if we go ahead and look through this, this list, one thing to note is that 6600 XTs, the XT versions, start popping up around the $500 mark. And that's what you can sometimes grab a 3060 for. Although those sell out pretty quick, I had to get the 550 version for the channel here. And if I scroll down to what's actually in stock right now, it's looking like the cheapest 3060 is coming in at $590. And I don't necessarily recommend paying that. So the main thing I want us to think about in this video is the 6600 better than the 3060? Because it's not. But I do want you to think about how much better is the 3060, because I know a lot of people are thinking about buying one as they've seen these prices come down a bit. But you might want to think about how much more are you paying, because you could pay a lot less still for the 6600, or you could pay a similar price or maybe even less for the 6600 XT. Now, I don't have an XT model myself to throw into these benchmarks, but basically add on about 20%, maybe a little bit less to the performance you're seeing on my 6600 if you want to get an idea of how it would do. Let's jump into the benchmarks, and then I'll give you more of my full thoughts. Well, here in Forza Horizon 5, we get our big win for the RX 6600 despite its lower street price. And to be clear, this is a bit of an outlier, and the win is actually mostly relying on AMD's Smart Access Memory. This is a feature that AMD introduced with its 6000 series cards and works best when you have a 5000 series AMD processor and a 500 series motherboard. Although some further expansions of that compatibility have been introduced, I really am only having my 5000 series processor and 500 series motherboard to test it on here, so do keep that in mind. Now, NVIDIA did respond to this with resizable bar support, which is a big component of what AMD is doing with Smart Access Memory. However, their support is pretty bad. They added it to a certain number of games, I think about 15 or 20 games at launch, but unlike AMD, they don't allow you to use this feature on any game that you want. They have to whitelist them, and as far as I know, they haven't whitelisted any of them in the last year since the initial support was added. So here's our big win for the RX 6600, although again it is reliant on that feature, so if you don't have a compatible CPU and motherboard, this would be more of a tie. And with that in mind, in this video I do have resizable bar support enabled on both the RX 6600 and the RTX 3060. Although again, the RTX 3060 can't always take advantage of it. Now, we're looking at it in 1440p, and we can see that the RX 6600 might still have a slight win here, but I would say it's been downgraded to basically a tie. So what happened? Well, this is one of the other big differences in the architecture between AMD's RDNA 2 architecture and NVIDIA's Ampere architecture, which is that as the resolution increases, RDNA 2 falls off performance-wise at a faster rate than Ampere does. So whether you want to look at that as RDNA 2 from AMD excelling at lower resolutions versus Ampere, or whether you want to look at it as Ampere excelling at higher resolutions, the fact remains the same. If you take cards that are about the same at 1080p, the Ampere GPU from AMD will tend to then pull away as the resolution increases. So in this case, the 6600's lead dramatically decreases at 1440p, which means that if you're considering these cards for a 1440p build, where both of them will admittedly struggle a little bit, the 3060 will have a better advantage than it would relatively at 1080p. But let's go ahead and look here at Cyberpunk. Now, first we're going to compare 1080p performance, because to be clear, I really do think that that's the sweet spot for both of these cards. And since I just showed you an AMD favored title with Forza Horizon 5, we're going to jump over here to Cyberpunk, which I think is generally considered to be a bit more geared towards NVIDIA, especially once you kick on the ray tracing or want to use DLSS. Although they did finally add in FSR support as well, which we'll see here as soon as this first benchmark pass completes. Right now we're looking at the 1080p Ultra settings. And to be honest, both of them are doing fine. The 3060 clearly does have the lead, but with both GPUs, I'd probably recommend the high setting instead, in which case both of them will be over 60 FPS. But what if you want to use ray tracing? Let's trace some rays. So if you want to trace the rays, honestly, both GPUs struggle, and you're not going to want to do it at native resolution unless on the RTX 3060 you want to maybe lock to 30 FPS, which I don't personally recommend. So we're using the RT Medium preset here, which has all the graphics settings at Ultra, but it then also kicks on some of the ray tracing. Not all of it, doesn't have reflections, and some of them aren't on their full effects. Notice that both of them require the upscaling techniques here, and so you can get a side-by-side comparison of FSR versus DLSS, and while one's called Ultra Quality and one's called Quality, they do generally give about the same performance boost. The reason we're seeing such differences in frame rate is, again, this is the NVIDIA ray tracing advantage. Although, to be honest, I really feel like even on the NVIDIA GPU, you're losing so much performance, and you are having to upscale from below 1080p, and DLSS does a better job here, I think we can see, but neither one of them to me looks as good as native, and I'd probably play the game without ray tracing on both cards. But that's personal preference. Now, let's look at 1440p again, because I think both of these cards are reasonable to consider at 1440p, and once again we get another look at FSR versus DLSS. FSR does better the higher resolution you go because it has more information in the frame to work with, and so while at 1080p I think DLSS was clearly better, here I think it's a little better. Notice that I'm running both GPUs at the high settings here instead of ultra, because I think to get nice frame rates at 1440p, that's what makes the most sense. Alternatively, by the way, we could have run both of them at medium settings at 1440p native rather than using the image upscaling, and you would be getting similar frame rates here. But once again, we see that at 1440p, the NVIDIA card, once again, is able to kind of stretch its headroom a little bit here. So again, I think for a 1440p build, we're once again seeing that the 3060 is probably the better choice. Let's jump into 1080p again, and this time we're looking at Horizon. I almost said Forbidden West, but no, this is still Zero Dawn, although I do hope we get a PC port of Forbidden West someday. I imagine it could take a while though. Anyway, it's 1080p, and the 3060 is still winning at 1080p, but this is one of those games where I've got to say both of them are delivering such good performance that yes, the 3060 is delivering better performance, but would you really notice it if you're not running a frame rate counter? I think you would just have a smooth gameplay experience that looked good on both graphics cards. So yeah, I don't think it's anything to be super concerned about. So once again, this video isn't about can the 6600 beat the 3060. It's more about whether it's worth paying more for the 3060, or a better way of phrasing that might be, how much more would you be willing to pay? You are getting more for your money. Has more VRAM, it's got better ray tracing, a little bit better rasterized performance here, and once again we'll see that at 1440p, it does start to pull ahead even more. Although I've got to say, both cards here are still delivering quite a good experience at 1440p maxed out ultra settings. And although the 6600 is occasionally dipping down to like 58, 59 FPS, it's certainly averaging over 60. And I'm also not overclocking it. And this 3060 model does have a factory overclock. So do keep that in mind when you're comparing these. And the 3060 model here certainly has an overbuilt cooler, although I probably could have overclocked it further. I chose not to do that. I'm comparing these cards directly as they're sold to the consumer. So when you're comparing it, keep that in mind. Once again, this is also a title where AMD is getting a bit of help from Smart Access Memory. NVIDIA gets some resized bar help here as well, although I think it is still, once again, percentage-wise, a bit better for AMD. Anyway, let's finish this out with some Red Dead Redemption 2, although I think I might throw in one more game here afterwards. And the nice thing is, if you're looking for 1080p ultra gameplay, both cards can absolutely deliver it here. Now, this is a game that supports DLSS, but to be honest, it doesn't give the dramatic performance gain. It does give a performance gain, but I've noticed for whatever reason in this game, the performance bump doesn't seem to be quite as dramatic as in other games. So I'm not going to be testing that out here, although I might do a separate video where I look at the RTX 3060 in this game, including trying to play at higher resolutions, optimizing settings, maybe even getting some 4K going using DLSS, that type of thing. But if you're just looking for 1080p, you can max this game out on both cards, and I really don't see a problem. Overall, they're both delivering fantastic performance, and you're probably hearing my children running upstairs, as you often do in my videos. We are doing this as a hobby in my basement channel, guys. Anyway, let's take one more look at another game here where we see that neither GPU can actually just max out every game at 1080p. This is Total War Warhammer 3, and to be honest, I think we can mostly blame this on the optimization of the game. This game is very difficult to run at its maximum settings, and yeah, the NVIDIA GPU does seem to be doing a little bit better, but it is a small difference, and like I said, neither GPU is able to hold 60 FPS here, but it is definitely a win for the NVIDIA card. Well, let's go ahead and pop back out for some final thoughts. All right, so what did we learn with the benchmark, the showdown between these two? I think we learned a few things. Yes, the 3060 is a better graphics card, and not just because this one has an overbuilt cooler. I mean, my 3080 and 6800 XT coolers are the same size. This thing is ridiculous. Anyway, but I think another thing we learned was that the 6600 can offer an absolutely solid 1080p gaming experience. The 3060 can offer a slightly better one. I think we also learned that they could both handle 1440p, sometimes with some compromises to your settings or using some image upscaling. But we learned that the gap widens at 1440p. And I would really say that you'd only want to grab the 6600 for a 1440p build if you were on an extreme budget. Whereas the 3060, I think, is a more reasonable budget choice for 1440p. Although even then, I'd still recommend trying to take it a step further if you can. But everybody's got their own budget and maximum limit that they can afford to spend. I'm tired of holding these things. Let me set them down. Anyway, how about ray tracing? I really did only test Cyberpunk, but again, that was only the ray tracing medium setting. I didn't even crank all the options all the way up, and both cards struggled, although clearly the 3060's ray tracing performance was far and away better. But personally, I wouldn't have used it on either card. If I was playing Cyberpunk on the 3060 at 1080p, I'd probably just do it at the ultra settings. maybe even the high settings. And if I was playing on the 6600, I would just play it at the high preset. And they're going to look good and they're going to perform well. And to me, just having to use image upscaling and then still maybe not even maintaining 60 FPS just really isn't worth it to me. So I wouldn't let the ray tracing performance factor into my personal decision between those two cards, at least not very much. What about the upscaling techniques? I think the DLSS option was clearly better, but FSR, I mean, you can definitely use it in a pinch to dramatically increase your frame rates, but I think there is a more noticeable image quality hit at these lower resolutions. It's at 4K with the ultra quality where I think it's most impressive and a decent competitor to DLSS. At lower resolutions, I really do think DLSS does the better job. So how much money is that worth it to you? If you're on a budget, I think this $430 option, I mean, if that's the most you can spend, it's going to get you a heck of a 1080p gaming experience. I don't think you're going to have any issues running current games, maybe high instead of ultra if you want 60 FPS. And then for years to come, yeah, maybe high instead of ultra. A couple of years down the road, maybe medium. And no, you're not going to be doing ray tracing, but you're still going to be able to enjoy your games and it's going to be just fine. So I really think the battle would actually come down to whether you want to go with the 6600 XT for around $500, and then what sort of a price you can find on the 3060. I think the 6600 XT, again, I didn't have one to benchmark, is going to slightly outperform your 3060 on its rasterized stuff, but not by a huge margin, and that's where your DLSS and your ray tracing might sway you one way or the other, depending on how much you value those features. Additionally, if you want to do some streaming, the NVENC encoder is better for that. It will look a little bit better. But I imagine people buying a 3060 aren't like professional streamers anyway, and it's really more of a hobby where, you know, it's probably not a make or a break type of thing. Now, if you're into professional production work and things like that, there are programs that do just work on NVIDIA and they don't really have AMD support or not very good AMD support, so another thing to throw in there. But I think in just a straight up gaming battle, budget 1080p, I think the 6600 makes sense. If you're going 1440p, I think the 3060 again might actually start to be battling that 6600 XT pretty closely. I realize my fat head's in the way of some of the things that I'm clicking on. So you want to think about that. And it also depends on the GPU market. The pricing is all over the place. But in the end, I think both cards did a pretty good job. The 3060 is a winner, and how much you care about that difference is really down to you. But also, do you just want to hold out for some new GPUs? We are getting closer and closer to the next gen launch. Although, my thoughts on that are, the next gen launch usually starts with the high end, and the more mid-range cards get phased in months later, sometimes even going on a year later, although that's pretty extreme. We also have the wild card of Intel GPUs launching soon and being probably competitive in this mid-range space, but we really have so many question marks on that that I can't really give you an informed opinion on exactly what's going to happen there. And if anybody else thinks they can, honestly, they really are just speculating. We don't know what the availability is going to be on those. We don't know if they're just going to be bundled into pre-builts. We don't know how many will be on the actual DIY market, what their drivers are going to be like. All sorts of question marks on that, including pricing. Now, are GPU prices going to start coming back up, or are they still going to be going down? That's another thing that we don't know. And like a lot of people waiting at the end of the 20 series generation to buy their 30 series card ended up getting absolutely burned because of the GPU prices skyrocketing with the 30 series launch. So again, I don't necessarily expect them to shoot up like that, but I also can't guarantee that they won't. So, lots of question marks here. I think the biggest one is whether or not Ethereum will really go proof of stake this, June or July that it's supposed to do that, which would help reduce the crypto demand and could flood the market with used mining GPUs and bring prices down. But we're not guaranteed that that's going to happen. The proof of stake itself might not happen. It's been delayed in the past. And we're also not guaranteed to get a flood of mining GPUs. It's possible that mining other cryptos would just become profitable enough that people would just switch on over to that and not sell off their supply. Anyway, I'm just happy to see prices coming down a bit, and I think it's nice to at least even be able to consider buying a $500 or less GPU that can perform okay. Even though, let's be real here, these prices are still way too high. I'd like to thank my channel members who've hit that join button down there. There's various perks available and all of that. And I hope all of you have an excellent day.